but I go back to work next week. All right, so welcome. So today we're going to talk about two things. One is we're going to get kind of nuts and bolts about doing pearls in terms of thinking about recruitment and screening and pieces like that, and stuff that you have to cover during a training, but honestly, I think is easier to do once you start doing the work. So kind of what do you need to cover about how to do the sessions we'll talk about today, and then we'll do a little bit digging deeper with problem solving after our session last week. So specifically, when we talk about how to do a Pearl session, we're going to talk about screening for eligibility, introducing and explaining pearls to a new participant. You have this green checklist that when we did hard copy, but this checklist that you kind of go through in that first session, we'll talk about that. And some other forms you do with enrolled participants, including generating a problem list. And then we'll spend a little time distinguishing between problem and goals as well. So in terms of adult learning tips for today's session, as you think about doing your training, and many of you already probably do this in your work, but in terms of facilitating well, these are the things that really have been shown to be evidence-based, right? In terms of helping people learn. Anything you can do to build trust with your community, which I actually feel this COVID time and Zoom time has actually helped us do as we kind of are all in this together. Try to be as positive as you can within reason without sounding like you're not paying attention, but it's good to smile. When you give feedback, being supportive in how you give that, constructive and supportive, and letting people know what they did well, but also kind of opportunities to improve and how you can support them. I think it's really important. We've all learned this in Zoom times to try to stick to a schedule, try to start and end on time, and let people know when you make changes. I think we've tried to give you the tools for this training to adjust as needed, given the audience, but letting people know when you make changes so they can plan their life accordingly. We have found the parking lot really works with doing a training because there's so much to cover, and you want to make sure that people feel heard. So whether it's a jot form, a chat box, if you're doing a virtual training, or in an in-person training, we just have literally flip charts that we put stuff on. And that keeps you on schedule, but it also makes sure that you come back to it, even if it's during a break or even if it's the next day of your training. As you all know, as good clinicians, asking open-ended questions is a great way to facilitate learning. And then being respectful of everyone's feelings and emotions, which may come up during a training like this, right? This can get personal fast as people think about the people they serve, about their family members, et cetera. So just, meeting them where they are. In terms of potential conflicts that can come up when you're in a group, we do find it's helpful to agree to class rules early on. So for example, if people are going to be doing kind of real plays during their role play, letting people know that everything that's discussed during the training, during the breakouts is confidential, that you're not going to share outside of this session. Another way to do that is just modeling, and teaching, the right thing to do so that people know how to resolve those conflicts, either in a training or if some potential challenge comes up with one of their participants in Pearls. This doesn't happen often, but you might have, if you have a large training, people who are conversing. Maybe they're just talking about like the football game, but maybe they're talking about how much they do not like, problem solving. And so you will have to do what you need to do to redirect and that behavior, and really just focusing on the training and trying to take the focus on any of the negativity that comes up. I will say I have pretty much at every Pearls training had one or two people who are skeptical of the model. So it's not that they're nasty about it. They're just like have a healthy degree of, will this work? Will my clients like this? Will they really respond to it? And I've gotten this much more often from actually very trained clinicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, than I have from others. And I think it's just, they've got a lot of tools in their toolbox. This feels very structured. They can't kind of use their therapeutic muscle. So I'm just letting you know that so that you know when it comes up, it's not surprising. And I just try to kill people with kindness, that, hey, let's try it out and see how it goes. And we're here to support you as you start your Pearls journey. It isn't for everybody, both clients and older adults. And so we try to and providers. And so we try to kind of communicate that openness as well. Okay, so Teach Back today. So the first thing that we'll have one of you share is tips for administering the PHQ-9. That will really depend on your audience, but there are some kind of standard tips that we recommend telling people up front, unless they're really well-versed in doing this instrument and with lots of different populations. And then the second Teach Back we'll do is sharing tips for identifying a problem, because as we talked about last week, that really is like the key step. And it can be hard, both for you as the Pearls provider, as well as for the older adults. So we do spend some time doing that together. Questions about the learning, adult learning tips, or what we're going to be doing Teach Back before we dive into the materials for today? Okay. So this is part where not having the training, doing the training in person means you may want to be prepared with materials. So it could be like having a Google Drive open, but this is where I'm going to be referencing a lot of forms. So just kind of heads up on that. If you are doing a training in person, then it's like printing out, the materials so that people have them in front of them or can flip through them. I think either of those will help. So the first thing we want to teach is, how do you engage somebody? And it's important to engage somebody in a really kind of open manner without necessarily using the D word, because there's a lot of stigma about depression and you might lose someone from the get-go. So we really encourage, when you train, that you let people know how it is that they were connected to a client, and then offering to help. And then asking just kind of a question of checking in, how are you, as a way to build rapport. It's really important too that you engage the client in conversation. So you don't want to necessarily just spend a whole hour seeing how they're doing, but you do want to see, hey, can I ask you some questions to see if you can benefit from what the Pearls program has to offer? The warning we give to trainees is you don't want to say too much about Pearls from the get-go, because it may build some expectations like, oh, that program sounds amazing. I would love it if someone came to my home and did this. They may not be appropriate for Pearls. You don't want to screen them out. So this is a sample script that people can use. Clearly they can make it their own, but the idea is to be engaging, try to get to the point where you're starting to do the screening as soon as possible without kind of saying too much. So the things to teach about screening for eligibility is you have to determine whether someone has clinical depression, and you have to determine whether they have any exclusionary conditions. This has all been done by phone and video conferencing during COVID. And I will say the big tip is mailing these things in advance can really help. I will say the mail system is a hot mess in some parts of the country, so that may or may not work well. I was just on a call the other day, and they were actually going out and dropping off forms to their Pearls participants. So just a heads up, remote times, this changes a little bit. So as you know, with Pearls, there's a few ways we think about depression, the PHQ-9, and then this screen for dysthymia or persistent depressive disorder. And you all are now very well versed in this. I do think this is one of those forms that you either want to have folks have in front of them, even if you're doing it virtually. It can be really helpful to jot down notes, or if people are using things digitally, just having it open on their screen. So the PHQ-9 stands for Patient Health Questionnaire. And really what you want to do is you want to do that first, because if somebody doesn't meet criteria for depression, there's no point in screening them for exclusionary conditions. Why take up people's time with paperwork if they're not a good fit for Pearls? And we have typically trained around this idea of determining whether they have minor or major depression. I will say this is not a Pearls requirement. So many agencies will just look for a cutoff score. They'll look for a PHQ-9 of greater than 6 or a PHQ-9 of greater than or equal to 10, because those are kind of two benchmarks for clinical depression. The challenge with just the cutoff score is somebody might have a lot of physical health issues and score quite high because of their tiredness, because of their fatigue, their pain, or their lack of appetite, not moving as fast. So some of those somatic symptoms. That said, it's a pretty standard criteria cutoff, greater than equal to 6 or greater than equal to 10. So it's very okay for you all to train up that way. We started doing it with minor depression and major depression because the model initially was just for people with minor depression. So we needed to check that. And then if they don't meet criteria using the PHQ-9, that's when you're going to do that other screening for dysthymia. So these are some of the tips for doing the PHQ-9, and I'd love to hear others that you guys have. So in the toolkit, we have these response choice cards for participants. So not just having the form, but actually just having in really big font what 0, 1, 2, 3, and means. So it's just like blown up on a page. And that can be helpful because some people get kind of overwhelmed with the questions. They may have some vision limitations. And so just kind of remembering that you need to answer one of these 4 ways can help. For some people, they're very familiar with answering multiple choice questions. For others, they're just going to want to talk to you and get to know you. And so really having some way to try to streamline the screening can help. It's really important to be neutral. It's hard to do when someone's particularly having a really tough time, but not saying things like, oh, great, I'm glad you're not feeling tired today, or, making any sort of judgment about their response. It's also really important that you read the lead into the question every time. So over the past 2 weeks, how often have you been bothered by, and then the symptom. And the reason it is because many people tend to not think of 2-week timeframes when people ask them questions about how they're doing. They tend to think of today, or they tend to think of the week. And that 2 weeks is really important for trying to get an accurate sense of their depression. It's not just feeling lousy today or not having interest in doing things today. It's actually not having that interest in doing things more often than not over the last 2 weeks that makes somebody depressed. And then to me, this is the most important one, is just encouraging them to choose an option that most closely matches what they're saying rather than giving them an answer. One way to really help do that, if someone's really struggling and just kind of talking a lot, is to just ask the question as a yes/no question first. And then if they say yes, you can help get them to determine how frequently. The 1, 2, 3. So the 1, several days, the 2, more than half the days, and the 3, nearly every day. I've also seen people pull out a calendar here to help people kind of think about the last 2 weeks, like in their minds. And then I've also seen this done visually, where there's 4 boxes. 1 box is empty, 1 is full, and then the others. So if someone's more of a visual person, that's a great tool to use as well. I'll pause here though. Other tips that folks have used when doing the PHQ-9 that would be helpful to all of us to know as we train. Okay.
I will say, and this is kind of, I don't want to get too far in the weeds, and this isn't applicable often, but with one patient in particular that I worked with, I had to sort of, I think the way that it's phrased, how often have you been bothered by any of the symptoms?
Oh, yes.
Or there was one lady in particular that her sleep schedule in particular was not because she was retired and she didn't have to be up at a certain time. She considered herself, anyway, it was kind of splitting hairs. It was an issue kind of in her, or the poor appetite or overeating sometimes is one of those two, where it can seem like an issue, but it's also kind of the splitting hairs of if it's not something that's bothering them, is it an issue? I don't know if anybody else has encountered that in terms of that delineation of how often have you been bothered by any of these symptoms?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Has anyone had to manage that before?
Yeah, excuse me. I've had a few people who are obese and they smile at me and sort of look at their belly. I'm like, but are you bothered by it?
Yeah.
Are you unhappy? It's not how other people feel. I want to know how you feel.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a nice way to phrase it. And I think you're right, Dina, that the reason it asks, how often are you bothered by, is it's really trying to get a sense of, is it a problem for you? Interestingly, we've seen some organizations that do pearls that they have these really, really high response rates, like 90% of their older adults do better between their pre-post PHQ-9. And when we've tried to unpack it a bit, some of what people have said is that these things still exist. They still have sleep issues. They still are feeling like they let their family down, but they're not bothered by it. And so they just start putting zeros. And it's just, some of it's cultural, like just, okay, I had this person come into my home and listen to me and like give me tangible resources. And then some of it is just, yeah, it's that their mood is elevated. So these things still exist in life and they're not bothered. So I think I like Cynthia's phrasing, like if that word is problematic for them, is it a problem for them or has it changed? I think that's the other thing you're trying to get a sense of. Like maybe they've had issues with sleep all their lives, but has something changed in the last 2 weeks or months that they want to comment on? But it's pretty nuanced and some people don't like the word. So I think use your judgment in terms of how much you stress that. But it's more, we're trying to get a sense of what things might be, what are some things you might want to be changing in your life or not feeling this way, and kind of framing it as the positive too. I'll keep my ears open though. I've struggled with that as well. And I don't know that I've come up with a big solution. So these are tips for specific questions. So depending on how familiar your trainees are with the PHQ-9, you might not have to go through these, but if it's brand new, I do recommend just spending a little time on this and then having people practice doing a PHQ-9. So getting a sense of, for the sleep and the appetite issues, what is going on? Is it trouble falling asleep or is it trouble staying asleep? This will help you if they're having trouble with their generating a problem list or identifying a problem. It's this, having that detail without getting too into the PHQ-9 where you spend a half hour doing it will help you be able to have more kind of person-centered or patient-centered discussions about what's bothering them. For question 6, people get kind of annoyed with all those concepts that are piled in there. And so just asking people to really pick the descriptor that resonates most. So they can still, they can feel badly about themselves and that they're a failure without having let their family down. And they can still endorse that, yes, I've been feeling that more than half the days in the last 2 weeks. For question 7 about trouble concentrating, it is really important to make sure that it's not so much a memory issue, particularly with older adults who many have some memory impairment, but it's really about their ability to focus or pay attention. One of these classic symptoms of depression is just kind of your mind wandering or ruminating or doing other things that make it hard to do something. And the PHQ-9, I think, gives the example of reading a book or newspaper, but use whatever example you have learned with the client if that doesn't resonate with them, particularly if they don't read, like you don't want to be insensitive. And then for question 8, this is a long one. And so we find it's helpful to pause. So telling your trainees it's okay to do that, moving or speaking so slowly that someone else could notice, and then pause, being fidgety or more restless than usual. You could even ask the STEM. And if you get 2 different scores for that one, we encourage you to use the score that's the highest. So to be more conservative there. So if somebody does not screen into PEARLS using the PHQ-9, you just want to briefly touch on this, that there's this other screen, the screen for dysthymia or the screen for persistent depressive disorder. And this is basically another check. Some people may have this chronic depression and not endorse the symptoms on the PHQ-9. So if they answer yes to either of these questions, they may be appropriate for PEARLS. But if they answer no, then you're done. No more screening left. This is when you do the kind of warm handoff to another service. So now that you've identified that somebody has clinically significant depression, you need to make sure that they don't have any conditions that may exclude them from PEARLS. So these are the conditions we ask about: psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar, substance abuse or alcoholism, and cognitive impairment. We've changed over the years, as we talked about, I think when we talked about the research a couple of webinars ago, where it's okay if they have these conditions as long as they're not active or functionally impairing a person. So this is often where we really stress, especially when an organization is starting PEARLS, to connect with their clinical supervisor about this. And for those of you who are already doing PEARLS, you could also draw on your own wisdom here as you talk about how you've managed the screen for exclusionary conditions in your organization. I think this basically just repeats what we just said. I do want to call out, though, some people do ask about where the brief 6-item memory cognition screen comes from. The questions are the same as what's on the mini mental status exam, but it comes out of a group in Pennsylvania, Chris Callahan and his colleagues who developed and validated that scale as just a brief screen. So this is where, depending on the trainees, you go through this quickly or not. This is something too, where I feel like you can get kind of bogged down in the training. So it's great to kind of keep it high level. And then if it's clear that your trainees have more questions, want to come up with more protocols, then this is a great thing to do after the training. You know, schedule a Zoom, go through the forms in more detail, and decide as an organization how you're going to handle some of these protocols. So you're all familiar with these forms, and I leave it to you to decide kind of how detailed or not. I will say too, some organizations have additional screening criteria to screen someone out. And so it's okay to add those. There's nothing about Pearls that says you can't use other criteria that work best for your organization. And in terms of functionally impairing, you know, really what we're looking for is, do you think someone can do the work? You know, do you think they're going to be able to keep a schedule with you, do homework in between? They don't have to do everything great or well initially, but just, is there something about their other co-occurring mental health issue or their substance use that might get in the way of that? That's really what you're looking for. So for this cognition screen, I will say some organizations do more in-depth screening for cognitive impairment, and that's fine. This is just meant to be the quick one. And so basically you just have a cutoff. And if somebody scores greater than or equal to 3, they're eligible. Less than 3, they're not. And then if someone you just kind of can't tell, they feel on the cusp, always engage your team and your clinical supervisor to help with this. If you don't have a team, your clinical supervisor is your person to help think through, is this somebody who's really a good fit for this program? So then after screening, you want to train that, you know, if someone shows they're eligible, you want to describe it and see if it's something they want to do. Someone can still say no. They can say, I'm eligible, and based on what you described, that's not for me. I'd much rather do, you know, I want to talk to somebody about this tough thing in my past, and this sounds very different. If they show that they're not eligible, though, you really want to make sure you have a plan in place. So you let them know that Pearls would not be a good fit for them based on the information you gathered. And ideally, you have a plan B. That can be very hard in some areas because there's very few services that go out into the home that don't cost money, that see older adults. So even if it's a remote option, a phone option, just having some other place to connect the person to can really help, because it's difficult. It's difficult to say no, but you don't want to just offer Pearls to anybody, not knowing if it's actually going to really help them with what they need right now. These enrollment forms are in the toolkit. The reason we have a consent form is because it's really awesome if you can get their permission to release information and share information with other providers in their lives. Not required to do this work. There's a letter for a PCP and a mental health provider. So someone could still do Pearls without it, but it's just something that makes, I think, the work a lot easier and the care more coordinated. We have a sample demographic form in there you can tell your trainees about. If you're already doing this as part of your organization, you can just skip it. And then we have a baseline questionnaire where we ask some baseline questions around their self-rated health, their physical activity, their social activity, and their pleasant events. And that's just so you can see if, in addition to depression, other things change over time. One of the things we talk about on TA calls is other outcomes you can measure. So know that this is not an exhaustive list. It's just, this is the tools that we include with the Pearls program. Questions about the screening before we talk about kind of what you do in terms of conducting the sessions with clients? Okay. So here, this is where you want to make sure that your trainees understand kind of what does a session look like and what needs to happen that first session, what needs to happen that last session. And so for the first session, you're really only talking a lot at that first session, because you got to introduce who you are, you've got to introduce what Pearls is, and you've got to introduce the structure of the treatment. That first session, you then do a PHQ-9. And it's part of the baseline and final questionnaire at the first and last session, but at all of their sessions, it's the only data collection you're doing. You then want to talk about the principles of Pearls, which I'll talk about next. You want to help them generate a problem list and keep that going. And then you briefly at that first session, teach them about the 7 steps of problem solving, treatment, and activity scheduling. We don't usually use the word behavioral activation, but you can use that if you want to teach them what that terminology is. So just a reminder that the baseline questionnaire is only done at the beginning. and it's just meant for you to look at change over time. But again, it's not required. So if your organization just says, we want to do depression, that's it, that's fine. You don't have to ask these questions about activation. When you are first administering the PHQ-9, it can be helpful to teach people about what it is. So we've talked about this a little bit. PEARLS doesn't have any formal psychoeducation per se, but part of the idea of the collaborative care and the depression care models are that you're identifying people who are living with clinically significant depression who don't know that that's depression. Maybe they think it's a normal part of aging to feel this way, or maybe they feel that maybe it's something going on, but they would never share it with anybody because of some stigma, and they never use the word depression. So part of your job in training up new PEARLS coaches or counselors is to help them teach people about why it is we do the PHQ-9 in PEARLS. And the two big things that you want to teach are that symptoms that you're asking about, those 9 questions, are signs or indicators of depression. And a great metaphor, because pretty much everyone you're serving has had some physical health issue, is to relate them to physical symptoms. So you can talk about cold or flu with many of, when I was doing PEARLS clinically, often people would have diabetes or hypertension or arthritis. So those were very tangible things we could talk about. Like, okay, with your hypertension, you've got to monitor your blood pressure periodically. And, you do it sometimes to see that it's acting up. So like you're feeling kind of lousy, you've got headaches, and you go to monitor your hypertension or your blood pressure, and you see that, oh my gosh, my systolic blood pressure is higher than usual. And so this is the same thing. The other good thing about asking the PHQ-9 at the start of every session is that it really provides a structure and a foundation for each session. So I always encourage you to teach your new coaches and counselors that this isn't just for them, it's for you. It is a way that you can see in an objective way, how are we doing? How are things going? Are your symptoms getting better? And if they're not, what else could we be doing about it during our brief time together? So just like any data collection, we try to frame, there's no right or wrong answers. It's not a test. It's the same with the PHQ-9. It's meant to be a tool, and it's meant to be a tool both for your new PEARLS coaches and counselors and for the older adults themselves. In terms of administering that baseline questionnaire, this is similar to the PHQ-9. I think you want to have people either have it in front of them or have those response choice cards so they don't have the whole survey and get overwhelmed by all the paperwork, but just know, okay, these are the questions I'm going to answer. This can be really important over the phone because it's hard to be asked a lot of questions on the phone without looking at something. I mean, it's really easy to just, can you repeat that? I'm not sure where we are. For the social activity questions, I think that can be a little difficult during COVID because people will often say things like, well, I used to, or I used to, and then, you have to kind of bring them back to, well, what about now? Tell me about in the last month or in the last week, what your social activities were like. And then the other thing to make sure is that if they're doing a lot, that this is really a typical week for them. I think sometimes, as we know, we can have around the holidays, very busy lives, and then the rest of our time is not so busy. So you really want to try to get a gauge for what is normal for them, not just this unique holiday week that they had for Thanksgiving, let's say, which is coming up. The main thing about the physical activity questions is that we have some pictures in there because many people, when they hear the word physical activity, they think exercise. They think lifting weights. They think, going to a gym. They think something that's very narrowly defined instead of sweeping their kitchen or some other way of moving their body. It can be, though, culturally insensitive when people look at the picture and think these are not the types of things that I do with my community. So just let them know that those are examples. One way to solve that is have them talk about what they do to move their bodies first, and then you can help them define their frequency or level of activity in the questionnaire. I do want to call out, if you're using that questionnaire, that at the end, there's a couple questions about strength and flexibility and balance. So even if they're not doing any aerobic activity, it's still worth asking those questions. Are you guys using this with your practice, the baseline questionnaire? Okay, cool. I mean, I think it's useful in that some people do not improve their depression very significantly, but they improve some level of activity. And I think Physical activity is always often recognized as an important, preventative measure for a whole host of conditions, or just managing chronic conditions well. And I think social activity has become more and more of a thing that people are paying attention to, given the risks around isolation and loneliness too. So great that you guys are using that. Okay, so let's talk about how you want to teach people to introduce themselves. So the way we've traditionally done it is you start this introduction with giving people a sense of what they should expect. This is brief, it's 8 visits over the next 5 to 6 months, and we're going to taper the frequency of them. And the reason we're going to do this is because you want to give people an opportunity to learn the skills over time. Couple things you want to highlight about doing that first session, because the first session is really going to set the stage for the rest, is yes, it's going to be a little bit more conversational. You want to get to know somebody, you want to figure out what matters to them, what words you want to avoid with them, and things like that. You really want to convey that you're here to meet them where they are. But you have to balance that with getting tasks done. I mean, it's a lot, that first session. When I first started doing this work, I remember thinking, like, there's no way it gets done in an hour. So this is where you have to use skills to rein in the big talkers or to draw out the quiet ones. And then there's also that baseline questionnaire to get done. So I think when you're training, it's just good to give people a heads up. This is a lot to cover. Yes, we get it. And it's kind of a balancing act, and it'll get easier over time. We don't usually practice. We do the first session, I think, only once during a training, but that's something that can be really helpful for people to practice more than once if they're nervous about fitting it all into a 1-hour session. And of course, if it takes 75 minutes and you can do that, that's fine too. In terms of how you talk about pearls, these are the things you want to highlight about the pearl structure. And again, I want you to think about appropriate words you could use too, if people don't like the word problem, for example. But there's really 2 skills that are tools in people's toolbox that you're teaching. One is teaching problem solving skills. And what that means is every week identifying one problem to work on, and then tasks that they do between sessions. And then the second skill or tool is planning pleasant or social or physical activities. This is where you really get to highlight this is a here and now program. We're not going to shrink their heads and talk about their childhood. But this is where you may need to do some work with the people you're training. If you are working in an organization or with people who are used to doing a long psychosocial history of somebody, like for 2 hours, this is not what Pearls is. We have found that a lot of that stuff actually comes out over the course of your time working together, so that if it's interfering with the treatment, you can start to address some of those pieces. But it's very important that with this, you just start with where the person is today and move forward. And that can be harder than not with some of the trainees. And that's part of the reason we practice, honestly, is so people can get a sense of like, okay, this can work. So the next thing that you teach is what the principles of Pearls are. And I think as many of you have taught other things before, this is kind of the why of Pearls. So you start with the what, it's brief, it's going to be 8 visits. We're going to teach you some problem solving and activity planning. And then you want to kind of hook them. Like, why are we going to do that? And there's 3 principles. And you really hit these the first visit. And I encourage you to teach your trainees to touch on these as often as they can, because it really is going to help sort of sell these skills to the person when you're not there to remind them and hold them accountable and motivate them to using these skills. So the first principle of Pearls is that those symptoms that the client now has just responded to having on that PHQ-9, you've just done that PHQ-9, those are due to depression. And it's the depression that may be causing those symptoms. And what we're going to do is we're going to monitor those symptoms over time. It doesn't mean that there aren't other things in your lives that are contributing to the depression, but it's your high blood pressure is a sign that your hypertension is acting up. You feeling like a failure is a sign that your depression is acting up. And use whatever metaphors you think based on who's in the room. Doesn't have to be hypertension. That's just based on the work we do. We tend to see a lot of folks with hypertension and diabetes. The second principle is that there is a link between depression, this chronic health issue, and unsolved problems. And that while problems are a normal, predictable part of living, a negative mood is a cue that these problems exist. And depression can really be caused or made worse by problems of living. So this is how there's always someone in the room who's like, no, there's other things that cause depression, and that's fine. But if we have a lot of problems piling up, it's going to make our depression worse. And what happens when those problems pile up is it interferes with our ability to address them. So it really becomes like this vicious cycle or this downward spiral where we're feeling depressed, things pile up, and then we feel worse because they're piling up. And it's really hard to get unstuck. That stuck is how we often hear older adults describe their depression. So what problem-solving treatment, or PST, does is it strengthens problem-solving skills, and hopefully taking steps or taking action will improve mood. The other things you want to talk about here is that you can always break down problems into smaller pieces or bite-sized pieces, because people will often kind of critique that there's certain problems that are not solvable. And then to really emphasize that some degree of control can actually almost always be achieved, especially when we're depressed and we're like seeing the world through these dark glasses. We kind of focus on the negative, but really our belief is that there's something you can do, even if you can't solve the problem in its entirety. And then the last principle is just, why do you do activity planning? So in addition to teaching these problem-solving skills, we know that depression stops people from doing enjoyable things. And again, we create that vicious cycle because fewer enjoyable things cause a worse depression. And so we spend time together planning things that are physical, social, and pleasant to try to increase those mood boosting activities that you do every day. Some people will just kind of be quiet while you go through the principles. Others will kind of want to engage. If someone's quiet though, you can, one thing we encourage you telling your trainees is, after each principle saying something like, what do you think? Like, can you remember a time when you were feeling lousy and there were things you stopped doing? Does that resonate with you? Or on the flip side, can you remember a time when you weren't feeling great and you did something? How did you feel? And kind of get them to engage with the principles a little bit in terms of thinking about it in their own life. So now that you've kind of sold them, hopefully on pearls, the next thing that you want to teach your trainees in this part of the checklist is generating a problem list. So basically you've kind of explained what pearls is and what you're going to be doing and why, and now it's time to kind of make it real for the person. And that's, you just pull out a sheet of paper. And you can use the word problems, you can use whatever word matters to them, but I really like this way of talking about it. Let's talk about the problems that are relevant to you or matter to you. What do you think are some of the problems that are contributing to the way you're feeling? Make it brainstormy. It can be big, it can be small. You don't want to get super specific with the problem list because you'll just get caught in the weeds. And you can remind the person that, this is going to be like our cheat sheet. We're going to refer to this every session. We're going to add to it. So don't feel like you have to have everything put out now. I have a colleague who, she changed the word problem list to like what I want to work on, because she was working with a lot of older men, particularly veterans, and they were just like not jiving with the problem list. So she just calls it what I want to work on. And so it's totally okay to do something like that. And then the last thing you do, and this feels kind of hard sometimes, I think, I always like to give my trainees a heads up on this, is you've kind of talked a lot and you've covered all this stuff. And now you want to kind of just introduce the pieces of pearls in a little bit more detail, but without really doing a working session. And so this is where you might pull out the worksheet and really just list what those 7 steps of problem solving treatment are that you're going to be practicing together at your next session. Show them the boxes where we're going to be planning physical and pleasant and social activities. And then just really emphasize that these are the pieces of the program. These are the legs of the stool, and we have this worksheet where we're going to do this all in one place. Sometimes people get kind of overwhelmed and think, oh my God, there's no way I'm going to do all that in one session. And that's okay. Sometimes people just seeing the worksheet and it's just one page, they feel a little bit more like, okay, I can do this. I think the last thing that you want to emphasize when mentioning the components of the program is that it's okay if you don't sort of fill out everything, because there may be some overlap between different activities. So often things that we enjoy are things that are social or physical, and that's okay. We're just trying to make sure you have pleasant social and physical, because those 3 pieces are mood boosting, but there can be some overlap. So that's how you teach that first session and going through the checklist as well as the screening. So it feels like a lot to cover, but I just encourage folks to have hard copies if you're in person for people to reference, and then just scheduling time during the training. You can do a practice of introducing that first session. And if you don't have time during the live training, have them practice that. Yeah, Cynthia.
I give them a file so that they have these things of their own.
Mhm.
And then also the problem list, they can add stuff when I'm not around.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, good point. I didn't mention that. So thanks for bringing that up. These are tools for not just your trainees, but for the older adult too. So bringing them there, having them organized in a nice way so that they can reference them and use them can be very helpful. And this is where, if you're doing it virtually, it's mailing it to them usually. I don't know a lot of older adults that have done pearls in a way where they're accessing all the materials digitally. For many people, it's still doing it by phone and having a stack of, a file or a folder in front of them. Other questions or concerns about covering all this content? And we save this to later in the training because it's kind of in the weeds and we want people to kind of get hooked on the treatment first. And then it's like, okay, this is what you got to do to like get someone in the door and then go over it with them. So that's why we schedule it this way. And we don't start a training with this information. Okay, so I just want to spend a little time on deeper dive on problems and goals, because what we find is really important during a training is not just to give people an overview of how to do problem solving treatment, but to really highlight that the first two steps are the most important and the hardest, so that folks don't go out in the field thinking, oh, every session is going to be just like my great role play that I did with my other trainee where we just like went through the steps. So that's why we spend a little time with these ones, because it really does set you up for success. So a couple tips, and this kind of really relates to what we talked about last week. For step one, for clarifying the problem, is really to frame it as something that is feeling or kind of going wrong in a person's life that contributes to their depression. They may not see the connection between this problem and their depression. They just might say, this thing is driving me crazy, and that's okay too. But it's helpful to kind of help them make that connection, because we've got lots of kind of things we'd like to be different in our lives, but focusing on those things that we think are making us tired, making us feel like a failure, making us have trouble concentrating, those are the things that we believe will be the most effective at alleviating someone's depression. The other really important thing is to try to get from, we talked about, I think last week, that feeling to a function. So what are the specific behaviors that are involved in your client's problem that can help you clarify what's going wrong? So, for example, somebody might say, oh gosh, I'm just feeling like really worried or really anxious. And that's a very common feeling. But what is it that they're feeling worried or anxious about? Oh, I'm feeling really worried about leaving my house, even though COVID is starting to get better and I'm vaccinated and I've gotten the booster. I'm still really worried that I'm going to get sick and die. I mean, like, that's a very specific thing. I'm not leaving my house, even though I think I can, because I'm worried I'm going to die, as opposed to being worried or anxious about, the fact that there's been a lot of things getting stolen in the neighborhood and people have gotten stuff taken out of their mailbox or the front of their apartment building. And so you're just really worried about your safety. So that's a very different type of worry and anxiety. So helping people get specific will really help them, set up the worksheet in a way that they actually come up with some reasonable solutions to help them address that particular worry or anxiety. The other thing that you can talk about is, framing it as too much of something, not enough of something, or something that's getting in the way of getting what they want. So you might have to ask some probing questions to get there. Sometimes people are used to talking about things pretty vaguely because, quite frankly, that's kind of all they've been asked to do, or they might be avoiding what's pretty challenging about it. So both those things might come up. And we talked about the lonely example last week. I think it's useful because it's really common. And so getting more specific is going to really help, focus the rest of that worksheet. And this example of not having anyone to talk to versus being too shy to talk to people, you're going to come up with different solutions for that. If you're feeling too shy, you're going to be trying to work on how you help somebody feel less shy and, boost up their self-esteem. Whereas if someone doesn't literally have somebody to talk to, you're going to think more about who are people they might connect with that might be in their life already, or they might be reaching out to. And then the probing questions are kind of, they vary. So, can you tell me what loneliness looks like to you? Or can you tell me about a time when you weren't lonely? Sometimes people are very, very hard to put the problem in detail. But if you ask them to think back to a time when they weren't anxious or they weren't lonely, they're able to describe behaviors that you then can put in the here and now. Oh, well, gosh, I wasn't feel lonely. Probably the last time was when my daughter lived in town, because I would have somebody to go to the movies with. And then suddenly it's like, okay, well, is that something you want to be doing now? Go to the movies with someone, and that helps you kind of get to what the issue is in the here and now. The main thing, I think, in addition to getting specific, is just making sure that the problem is something that involves your client. So last week we gave the example of my children never call me, and then flipping it to I rarely talk on my children on the phone. And the reason that's important is for many older adults, they get sort of set in this kind of, it's everybody else's problem but mine, like broken record. And so it can be really hard to solve that, because at the end of the day, though I would love to be able to control other people, like we often can't. So it both helps them get to solution generation about something they can do, but it's also just, it's more achievable, right? I mean, I can say my children never call me and just get down in the dumps and just sit there, right? But that's never going to get us to a goal-focused or solution-focused approach. And clearly, you could be frustrated about rarely talking to your children on the phone, and they may never return your calls, but it might help the client get to other ways they can communicate with their children or other people they could talk to on the phone. So it also helps kind of widen the potential for goals and solutions for this client. In terms of setting a realistic goal, there's a couple things that we think about. It is often a specific action or set of actions that will help solve the problem. And because we've defined something behaviorally or in terms of resources, it often should be defined that way. So if the problem is I'm feeling lonely, and then the goal is I'm not going to feel lonely, like you can just see that's really hard to even wrap your head around what a solution would be like there. And so these are some examples of typical goals that I think are nice because they're very concrete and they're very specific and they're actually achievable potentially. So I can find ways to get transportation so I can get out of my house. I love that goal because it's not saying I am going to do it. Like next week, I'm going to get a van and go to the senior center. It's like, no, I'm just going to figure out what my options are. That's a bite-sized, achievable goal. Rather than solving a transportation problem in 1 week, which feels a little bit unrealistic for many people, particularly now. Talking to at least three people this week, communicating with my children at least 3 times this week, and exercising at least 2 minutes a day. I love that last one too, because many people will set activity goals that are just kind of wildly unrealistic. And so it's an important thing to have 2 minutes a day because that fits with that activity planning or behavioral activation piece where even a little bit of activity is going to help with being a mood booster. And sometimes during the training, what you can do is you can actually, how I had I am lonely or my children never call me, you can just put that up, like put it up on the slide or put it up on a flip chart and then ask people to, now that I've told you about all these tips, help me make this more specific or help me. So you don't have to kind of answer for them. You can kind of see where they're at and do this like group coaching together where they go through step 1 with you and try to ask you probing questions to get more specific. And the same can happen with a goal. I can give some outlandishly vague, goal that's totally unrealistic, and you can pretend to be my counselor all in a group together. And then people can learn from each other what questions they're asking and what tricks they're using. So you've often heard SMART, probably if you're writing any action plans or getting any funding. I do think this is a helpful rubric though for clients too, because it's going to help set them up for success and help them get that specificity and that realisticness that's needed to do this work well. So specific is really helping the client exactly what it is they're going to do, when they'll do it, and with whom they'll do it. I will say some of that happens during the action planning, but the more specific they can get in the goal, the more likely their solution will help them get to that goal. So it's a little bit of a balancing act, you know, how specific somebody can get with a goal versus they've got actually a couple ways, like different people to do their physical activity with. And so the solutions are actually going to be identifying those different people. Measurable is about quantifying. You know, this is just going to help somebody see it and know that it's happening or not, and then come up with solutions to get there. So how often or how many of something are they going to do? I'm going to try to call one person this week. The attainable piece we talked about when we were talking about the problem solving steps in terms of, does the client have the ability, capacity, or resources to achieve this goal? So do they have money? Do they have time? Do they have a raincoat? I mean, whatever it is. And so making sure that they often narrow the goal into something that's attainable. And that could be like that example about transportation. So maybe they can't start walking up and down their block next week because the weather's lousy and they don't have an umbrella or a raincoat, but maybe the goal can be just getting something that makes them feel comfortable walking outside. That's a much more achievable goal to get them to where they want to be. Realistic is about that reasonable piece. You know, can they actually do it? This is the, like, I'm not going to go exercise at the gym 7 hours a day, 7 days a week if I'm not exercising at all now. And it's really important to keep it realistic those first few sessions, because that's where you're really trying to sell the client on their ability to do this work and that this is something they can do and be successful at. And then the time bound piece is similar to measurable, but it's specifically, you know, can I do this within a week, or can I do this within 2 weeks? And some goals are really lend themselves better to that monthly time because they actually need to take several steps to achieve them. So this is the example of getting in shape. Often people do things that are kind of vague about exercise or physical activity, losing weight, managing pain, getting sleep. And so, like, important, but it can be really overwhelming. And often people have been telling them to get in shape, or they've been telling themselves to get in shape, like Cynthia, to your comment about the gentleman and talking about his weight. And so it's hard to measure success, and it's hard to come up with appropriate solutions. So this one really shows you how you could break it down. So for example, if the goal is exercising 2 minutes a day, that's much more specific and measurable and attainable and time bound and realistic, right? All that good stuff. And then those solutions are easier to connect to that goal. Lifting soup cans, walking to the mailbox, or moving around in my wheelchair. If you put the goal as get in shape and then get to solutions, they can be kind of much bigger and harder to achieve. And then you might be setting that client up, you know, to basically have another week where they're trying to get in shape and not actually able to do that. The other hand, I do want to comment on, you know, the need to be specific, because you can overwhelm people if you set a goal that you just think is going to be hard for them to achieve. So the example here is if they say, okay, my goal is to exercise more this week. That way, the person who's depressed might be like, okay, I'm not sure where to start, and I'm not sure when it's going to be enough. And so because of that kind of negativity depression does to us, it can make them much more likely to be overwhelmed. So this can be kind of useful to do on a flip chart or on the screen, like playing around with the difference between get in shape and the difference between exercise more this week and the difference between exercising 2 minutes a day, and what different solutions like people come up with. And that can be a way to kind of reinforce the value of getting specific with goals. So thoughts about that, steps 1 and 2, anything I didn't say that you think has really helped you in your Pearls work, or the Pearls folks that you supervise that you think should be added here?
I try to be simple, something you can do in the time that we will be apart. And I trip thing, I think that was in my training about, you know, I want to go on a trip. you know,
Right,
hey, you're gonna be back in a week, you
right,
know?
right.
Organize, get that together and go, and, you know, how about, you know, talk to your daughter and see if she'd like to go on a trip with you. You know,
Totally. That's a great way to narrow it down, Cynthia. Yeah. Yeah. Cause people, you wanna, it's a little bit of a dance, cause you want them to feel that they're working on something that's important to them, and maybe going on a trip is important to them. But
but
it's helping people realize that in order to go on a trip, there's several things that need to happen. And if they keep saying to themselves, I want to go on a trip and doing nothing, that's kind of a sign that they need to break it down. So I love that. Yeah. Who are you planning on a trip with? And oh, my daughter. Okay, well, maybe that might be something we can work on this week. Yeah.
Right. And I give them more simple ideas if they can't come up with it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's okay. I think I would just use whatever it is they've already told you about. So for example, if they've not shared anything about like going to the senior center to be social, I don't usually encourage or recommend it around the senior center unless they've said, gosh, I really need to meet new people. So yeah, I do think they're looking to you sometimes for advice, but we're trying to kind of pull out what it is they've already said to come up with things that matter to them. Yeah.
My-
And you
the,
can always use the activity planning as a way to get simple.
the problem I run across is that, you know, that on the worksheet, we'll come up with 3 or 4 ideas.
Yep.
Then the pros and cons. And I run across people who are like, I want to do all of these.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, give yourself a break. I'm going to
Yes.
be back in a week.
Yeah.
Pick one. Pick one.
Yeah, I mean it's tough because like you want them to be successful, and if people are jazzed, you want them to carry it out. But you can do what you did. I think pick one and start small. You can always say something like, two, why don't we work through one? And then if you do that and you still feel you want to do some additional stuff, have your worksheet handy and give that a try. And then that way you could even write that as one of the steps in step 6, that after they've done the 5 things to achieve goal or solution A, then, step 6 is look at solution B, C, and D and pick one to work on until my next session with Cynthia. And then that way they kind of do the things they've said to do instead of saying, I'm going to do everything and then I'm going to do nothing. Right. I think we've all been there. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I try and get them to just commit to one.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Yeah.
If time permits, if you want, the others are great, but let's just commit to one.
Yeah. And they can always add more next week too. So you can always encourage the value of starting small to learn this new thing together. And then we can see where you're at next week. And first thing we're going to do is check in about how this went. Yeah, great. Thanks, Cynthia. Other ideas or questions about this part, the deep dive and ways. I mean, I encourage you to make it interactive with your trainees in terms of having them try to make a problem more specific or having them try to make a goal more specific. And you could do it in pairs, or you can also do it. The thing I like about doing it together is people get to hear what kind of questions other people are asking, and they just see it modeled in different ways. Okay. So we've covered a lot. I don't think you have questions, but let's think about what are some of the we'll do one of these and then we'll do the teach back. What are some of the common questions that come up during this part of the training? So I would say when you're doing the first part, when you have to do all that stuff on the checklist in that first session, there's often some pushback from trainees about like, there's no possible way I'm going to do this in 1 hour. Is there any flexibility in whether we do this over more than one session or don't cover everything? So what might one of you say if somebody asked you that during a training?
Sometimes I feel like I have to answer all the questions, guys. Come on. I tell them you can break it into 2 if you need to.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I always, when I'm having a first meeting with someone, I allow for a lot more time
Mhm.
than the other appointments. And I find a way to say that usually we try to keep it to an hour-ish because people want to tell me their life stories.
Mhm.
It's just, I don't know why that is. It's just, I may talk a lot, but they talk more. How's that?
Mhm.
And then, giving them the forms, believe it or not, I do believe that it gives them, how do I phrase this? A moment where they stop talking,
Mhm.
where they're looking at the various forms.
Yeah.
I can chime in and get something done. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's how you manage the time with someone because some people will share nothing and then you've got to work on sort of drawing them out. But for those that are kind of keep getting sidetracked or on stories, the forums kind of help you bring them back to the work you're doing together today. And gently redirecting. Oh gosh, that's so interesting about your daughter. I think let's talk about this next piece next about the worksheet we're going to be doing together, because this might actually fit with that piece you're talking about with your daughter and something we might be able to work on together. Usually there's a thread you can grab onto. Not always, but then usually it's something like, I want to make sure we get through the things today that I'm required to get to as part of doing this program. And I'll make sure we leave time at the end to talk about that soccer game that you thought was so amazing or something, you're able to let them know that kind of, I've got a job here, just like your doctor has a job when you go to the doctor and only have 30 minutes or 15 minutes. It's the same with you. And it's not because you don't care. It's just that, we want to make sure you get this program the way it's intended. And so you can kind of use different strategies there. Yeah. Totally okay to split it up though into more than one session. We have heard from people that it's been really hard to do this stuff over the phone in one session. So, you may have to do some refresher depending on how long between that first, those first two calls, but yeah, it's okay. Or schedule more time, like you said, Cynthia. Okay. All right, let's practice a little bit together before we end today's webinar. So I'd like one of you to teach tips for administering the PHQ-9. So we had that slide about kind of overall tips and then the specific questions. And then I'd like one of you to help us do a better job with step one, identifying a problem during problem solving treatment. So who wants to do the first one?
I can do it.
Awesome. Thanks, Allison.
Am I unmuted? Okay.
Yeah, you're
Couldn't
there.
tell.
I know. Oh, Zoom. Yeah. Great. And I'll give you a minute to prepare. Do you want me to pull up slides or anything else in, or do you have stuff in front of you?
Yeah, sure you can. I think I've got the slides somewhere in
Okay.
the
Yeah,
tabs.
no, it's just in one place. I don't know about you all, but I have too many things open on my computer usually. And then what about who would like to help us identify a problem? So help us do step one.
I'll try.
Okay, great. Thanks, Cynthia. And I can pull up slides if you'd like to.
Yes, please.
So first, close your eyes so you don't get barfy. Da, da, da. There we go. Okay. So whenever you're
Thank you.
ready, Allison. Yeah, no problem.
Okay. I think there were a couple slides of these, right?
There are two slides.
Okay.
And I encourage you to, if you have other tips that you thought of while we've been talking today, feel free to add them. I think there's no right or wrong answer besides filling it out for them.
That's fair. Okay. And I'm going to try to teach this a little bit as if I were talking to our students, because probably that'll be at least some of the people will be training for Pearls. So I'm going to try to tailor it.
Oh,
So
very cool.
if part of it sounds a little bit weird or you don't recognize something, it's probably because it's something they do.
Oh, great. I love it. Yeah, that makes it more real. Nice.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to talk about some tips for administering the PHQ-9. And that is the patient health questionnaire. And for some of you, you may have already explored this questionnaire before, either if you're doing therapy with someone and you're getting a formal screening of their depression symptoms, or if you've done a health risk assessment before, you might recognize some of these questions. So we're just going to talk a little bit about what some good ways are to engage with people as we do the PHQ-9 in Pearls, because it can help things along and make sure that we get an accurate representation of how they're really feeling and not just, and not leading them accidentally. So one thing that can sometimes be helpful for our clients are to give them maybe some response choice cards, especially maybe if we're not physically with them, if they're over Zoom or over the phone, finding some way to get them some pieces of paper that have a blown up version in case they have vision concerns of your scale with your 0, 1, 2, 3 on there, just so that they're able to kind of see what those numbers are and what those numbers represent. So it also helps them remember as you're asking them those questions. Sometimes people will find that helpful. Another thing to do is just try to be neutral as we're asking the questions. And this is mainly so we're not trying to assign some kind of value to whatever answer that they're giving us. So, if they say that they're not really having sleep or appetite problems this week, although of course that's wonderful, we don't want to necessarily say, oh, that's great, because later on, maybe they won't want to respond that way because, we were so happy for them the first time when they weren't struggling. So just something to keep in mind. Sometimes it can also help to read, the stem or the lead into the question fully each time to kind of, help place the client back in the question so that they can remember, their time frame, those 2 weeks, and if something is really bothering them, so that they can really identify, is this a problem for me, or is this happening, but I'm not really concerned about it right now. Another thing that can happen is to try to encourage them to choose options that closely match how they're feeling if they're not totally sure of their number or their frequency. Sometimes I'll tell clients just to give me their best guess or their best ballpark, what feels right for them. Because sometimes the numbers can feel maybe a little categorical to them. So I think trying to define it on that scale can be helpful. So you can also ask the question as more of a yes or no question as to whether it's something they have been experiencing those past couple weeks. And then if so, then you can do your 1, 2, 3 numbers. And sometimes that kind of helps people decide if it's something to explore the question further. And these right here are, just some tips for some specific questions that we have on the PHQ-9. So some of these questions, for instance, number 3 and 5 that have to do with sleep concerns or appetite concerns, there's certain ways of asking it that can be helpful. So in the sleep, for instance, you may remember that it asks about whether they're sleeping too much or having trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. So after they say, give you a 3 for that one, if they haven't clarified, you might also ask, which of those sleep problems are you having or is bothering you the most? So that way you kind of know specifically what's happening with them. For question 6, it's somewhat of a similar thing because we've got several different choices here about how they may be feeling or thoughts that they're having, but it's still important for us to know what they're experiencing. For number 7, when we talk about trouble concentrating, it's also important to clarify that it isn't exactly asking about memory, but rather about being able to focus and pay attention to something. So a lot of our older adult clients will have, not necessarily all, but some will have some memory problems, but that's not necessarily what we're looking at. We're trying to see if they can focus on a specific thing that they're trying to do. And so you can tailor that to the person if they don't read the newspaper, or I think the other one is watching TV, something that will resonate with them. And this last one, question number 8, it's a really long one. And so something that can help is as you read this part about moving or speaking slowly, once you get to this comma right here, just kind of take a pause and break up that sentence and then say, or being fidgety or more restless than usual. So that way it kind of gives the client maybe a chance to think about those things and decide which of those pieces applies to them, if at all. So I hope that is helpful, and I hope that helps you on your PHQ-9 journey, no matter in what capacity you're using it here.
Nice. I love the PHQ-9 journey.
We use it a lot for different things.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, so I really liked how you grounded it, and I would encourage others to do this. If you know people are using the tool in another practice, then yes, because that often happens. You start teaching it and someone goes, wait, I know this. We've done this for blah, or I've had this in my doctor's office or whatever. So it's good to kind of give them a heads up. They might have seen this before. But really nice. You covered all the key things to cover in a way that was super natural. And I really liked your examples, like when we were talking about the trying to be neutral, and you explained why that is, that if you tell somebody it's wonderful they're not sleeping or eating too much, that they may be less likely to disclose or divulge that next time you do a questionnaire. So really nice. And I also liked, and I realize this is something kind of nuanced here, but this piece at the bottom about kind of helping them pick an answer. You said something like, just pick the best ballpark that works for you. And so sometimes it's even just choosing between two that can help somebody find the right thing. And that a number doesn't always feel like the right fit. So they can just use the words. One thing we didn't say is, like, people can fill this out themselves too. So if people are very comfortable filling it out, please encourage them to do so. And quite frankly, try to encourage over the course of Pearls, because you want to really help them learn that this is a tool they can use without you there. Really nice, Allison. Other feedback for Allison on things she did well or opportunities for improvement?
You did so great, Allison. Just the way that you explained everything was really, and I recognize you were working on explaining it towards students, but it wasn't done in a way that was like patronizing or that they didn't know some of these concepts already. So you were assuming that they had some kind of baseline knowledge, which we know that they do. But the way that you presented it was just really straightforward. The rationales and like the little explanations that you were giving on each point were really great, like true to CBT, right? We got to give those good rationales. So I just thought you did a really lovely job.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's well said, I think, Andrea. Like, it's hard to teach this because you don't want to be patronizing, but you also really want to make sure they follow some certain guidelines. Yeah. One frequently asked question we didn't talk about is people will ask whether they can replace words. So for example, that depressed, sad, is it depressed, sad, and blue? Is that the, I always mix up which three words are there, but I have seen people use like more culturally appropriate words there. And I just encourage you to do your homework. So somebody may have already figured out not just how to sort of translate a form into a different language, but how to culturally adapt it into to reaching different populations. So I remember we were doing work with the older Somali community here, and we found that at that depressed, sad, and blue question, that there was this sense of like worry that was there, that wasn't anxiety, but they used the word worry in terms of how the language was translated into English. So just use your community experts if you don't have folks on your team who know the culture. But that is a question we get asked often, and we usually encourage people to kind of do their homework, or we try to look into how people have adapted the form or the words for different populations. Awesome. All right, Cynthia, you want to help us do step 1, problem solving? I can pull up the slide. Wait, last slide's there. Okay.
Oh, no, I do not want to do it, but all right. So,
That could be your problem. You help us get more specific about.
well, okay. So what I'm thinking is that I would be teaching this to people who want to be coaches. And
That's right.
I don't think, and I mean this as a compliment to all of you, but I don't think the majority of them would be as well educated as all of you.
Yep.
I think they will have BSWs, maybe a master's in social work, that kind of thing. So
Yeah, that's a good point, Cynthia. And I think the other thing to remember is when you're teaching this section, you've already taught them the 7 problem solving steps. So the reason we don't teach this when we first teach the problem solving steps is we find it's just too overwhelming. Like, you got to kind of keep it pretty short, teach the steps, and then get them to practice. And then all sorts of questions come up, and so then you come to this after they've practiced, and it's a way to just kind of more deeply engage with the material. And more often than not, they've come up with these issues during their practice. So just to remind you that kind of where this is happening in the training too.
Right.
great.
And I believe in class participation, people. Hello? Okay, so turn your mics on, please.
Cynthia, remember everybody participates in different ways.
Yes. At this point, I have a feeling in my classes, they'd be talking.
Yeah. So you're going to have to work more on managing like 3 people talking at once and making sure people feel heard. And honestly, if you're getting a lot of talkers in a training, I suggest you put them into smaller groups. Like it makes it easier. Having a co-trainer can help you do that too. So yeah, lots of tricks of the trade.
Yes. So a problem is something that's gone wrong in their life. Problems contribute to depression in that they are unresolved. And so one of the things that I would use if I was teaching this class is I would go back to that original problem that we brought up early on in the class. And that is of our being away from work.
Mm.
So a problem for us might be that we are away from work, and that's too big, that we can't deal with that all at once. So we have to narrow it down to a specific behavior. And I would ask the class, what specific behavior, instead of I'm away from work for 2 days, what specific behavior would you be interested in working on? What problem can we clarify so that we work on one problem at a time? Anybody?
I'm going to have 750 emails when I get back to the office, and it's going to take me a whole nother day to go through them when I get back.
Wonderful, thank you. So let's use that. That's a more specific problem rather than the whole 2 days. So there's 750, you said? You beat
A
me.
bit of an exaggeration, but yeah.
I know.
Feels like 750.
Right. So for you, is that too much of something, not enough of something, or is there a barrier to getting what you want?
It's both. It's too many emails. It's not enough time to go through the emails. And yeah, it's both.
Good. So we have this specific problem, so many, let's use the too much of something. There's too many of the emails to deal with in one day. Okay, next slide, please. So they may be that because it's too general as a problem, having that specific too many emails to deal with, it helps us to narrow down what we need to do. So sometimes we have to ask probing questions. That's what I did with you all. I tried to get more detail, something that gave me something so that I can get to a spot where instead of having just a problem, we now have a goal. The goal would be to what? Somebody? Allison? What's the goal?
It sounds like the goal is for Andrea's problem, to reduce her amount of emails that she's got,
Okay.
or create more time.
Okay.
They're 2 different things.
Or possibly could it be to get through all of those 750 emails?
True.
Okay. So too many emails, right? All right. So we want to make that into what we do for that is there's too many emails. We turn that problem into that goal of answer the emails, right? It's very specific. It gives us an answer. What do we need to do? We need to go through all of the emails. I think there's another slide, isn't there?
I think the other slides are on goals. Oh, making sure it involves the client.
So this is something you can manage as an individual. You're not asking your boss to take on those emails. You're not asking a coworker to answer them for you. And so then we would go into specific, what can we do? And that would be another section, isn't it, for the class, or should I go into that?
Yeah, no, this is great. No, Cynthia, thank you. And thank you for engaging the fellow trainees and calling them out and using an example that we started the training with. I think that's a great way to do it. And for some people, it's much easier to learn when they pick something real. So Andrea picked something that I think many of us can relate to. And that kind of feels unsurmountable and that you don't do anything about. You're like, I'm going to go to a training and I'm going to have 750 emails, the end. And it's just going to start to get stressful. So I liked how you picked that too. And I think there was something else you said. I liked how you too kind of broke it out so that it wasn't just that Andrea got specific, that the problem of being away from work for 2 days is that I have too many emails, but it was having really her think a little critically and thoughtfully about, well, why is that a problem? I've got too many emails and I don't have enough time to address them. And I would argue, maybe if you ask Andrea another question, that the reason that's a problem is because she's not able to do something else, number 3. Like answering those 750 emails probably means there's something else and Andrea is not able to do, whether it's other work or having dinner with her family, right? So great idea to like kind of get specific with your trainees and not just have them get specific on the behavior, but really walk through the too much, not enough in a barrier. So I really like that, Cynthia. Yeah. Other comments?
I was just going to second that I really liked how you engaged us and used an example that was relevant to kind of help focus that thought process, because I think for training purposes, that will really help people understand it in a way that's relevant to them, which will help them translate it to people they're working with and have it be relevant.
Yeah. And also humor. Humor is always a great way to get people to just pay attention and laugh and take a break. So it all made us laugh, which is great. Yeah. And it's tough. I think one of the things we didn't talk about today with the goal, you started to talk about, Cynthia, like, if the goal being to answer all the emails, might be a way to solve that problem. And this is where I think the goal and the solution kind of go hand in hand, right? And overlap in a way that may not be actually that helpful. Like to a certain degree, answering all the emails is one possible solution. It may be helpful for Andrea to pick as a possible solution not answering those emails. And like, what are the pros and cons of that? Because often we get sort of caught in this way of always doing things. Like I always go to a training and then I always stay up late at my hotel room doing the work I was supposed to do that day. But that might not be the best solution for us. Yes, it achieves our goal of us getting through those emails, but it doesn't achieve our goal of like not feeling stressed out and overwhelmed by it. So sometimes it can help to keep a little wiggle room between the goal and the solution so that people can experiment with like, well, what if I don't do the thing I always do? And that might open up new ways of hopefully being less depressed, right? So that's something that I wanted to call out. It comes up usually during the practice. Like the difference between a goal and a solution can get kind of fuzzy, and that's okay.
Yeah, but when we go to the solutions, 99% of us, I bet, would say, I'll stay up late tonight and go through that.
Yep.
And
they would.
Is that a realistic goal to go through 750 different emails?
Right.
Tonight.
Right.
You
right.
know?
So good point. So
Right.
what are the pros and cons of doing that? And can I actually even do that? So that's a really, yeah. And that's what problem solving is about.
And another just sort of point, and you already sort of referenced this about using humor, and I think you did it with humor, but also I think this comes up when you're helping clients identify problems, is sort of calling them out on that extremity of like, is it really 750 emails,
Totally.
And oftentimes someone is saying that in a way that we understood because it feels like 750, but sometimes it really is that they are exaggerating the breadth of the problem. And so I think sometimes it can be an opportunity to help them reconceptualize the problem in a more realistic way.
Totally. Good point, Dina. And that happens sometimes in the pros and cons.
750 is right on the ball.
I know what Andrea does for her day job. I bet she has a lot of emails.
Oh yeah, it's totally possible. I'm not shooting down the 750
Yeah, no,
email
I think it's
possibility.
a great point, Dina, because I do think that it's that like negativity, half glass empty thing that happens when we're depressed. And so a lot of the purpose of it can seem so like anal to do problem solving this way. You could be like, I can just pick something and do it. But it's to help us identify that we're doing that. We're either doing that magical thinking that's totally unrealistic, or we're like Debbie Downer, seeing everything as impossible when in fact it's not. And that's your job as a coach partially, and the people you're training is to help see when either of those things are happening and use the steps of problem solving to help break that really. So yeah, great points.
I find that when I'm teaching classes, using humor
Yep.
breaks the ice more quickly.
Yep.
And so I use it a lot.
Yeah. And this is a know your audience thing too, Cynthia. I find a lot of people respond to humor, but what is humorous to some people is not to others. So you do have to be somewhat knowing your audience here. And I think I've told you one of our training videos, like the client swears a lot, and it's just a demo, but I've definitely gotten feedback on eval forums like that people did not find that appropriate. And some people are laughing and some people are like, that is not professional. So I think you just have to kind of, sometimes you learn the hard way, and sometimes, you know, you learn as you're getting to know people while you're drinking coffee before the training starts. So I want to be mindful of time. So next week, Caitlin's going to come and she's going to talk about what you cover during a training about implementing and evaluating pearls. So even though the training's focused on skill building, you're going to get questions all the time about how to actually do it after the training. So she's going to cover that. There's some brief material to look at. You all have been implementing this, so you probably know it well. And so just for next time, prepare for that. I will not be on the next 2 webinars though, so I will really miss working with you guys. You've done so well. I was telling Caitlin about it yesterday, how I've been really glad we're recording because like I'm going to totally use all your language going forward. But it's been a pleasure and a joy, and I know we will stay in touch because my job is help support you after this is done and figure out, you know, get in the weeds of training and talk about what's working and also get your ideas. We're always trying to make it better, and we rely on folks like you to help do that. So thank you in advance, and I look forward to hearing how it goes the next few weeks with Mark and Caitlin.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thanks, Leslie.
Thanks,
Bye,
guys. Have a
Leslie.
great afternoon.
Too. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Oh.